PCI Pharma Services, your world-leading CDMO.
Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us today. We have our webinar, which is titled From Clinical to Commercial, Introducing Devices Earlier to Streamline the Drug-Device Combination Journey. And for today's session, we are joined by two of our experts, Bill Welch, who is our Executive Director of Marketing Development, and Justin Schroeder, who is our VP of Global Technical Services. And they'll be sharing their insights on how early device integration can de-risk development, streamline, scale up, and bridge the gap between clinical and commercial manufacturing. They're going to be covering key decision points around device selection, design for manufacturer considerations, and the value of an integrated approach to sterile filling, assembly, packaging, and testing. As always, we would love to encourage you guys to actively participate with us today. So please do utilize the Q&A feature at the top of your screen to submit any of your questions throughout the presentation. Bill and Justin will do their best to answer it throughout, or we will also be saving 10 to 15 minutes at the end for any additional questions that you might have. And to ensure a smooth experience, we just kindly ask that you remain on mute while Bill and Justin are presenting so that we can hear all the awesome things that they're going to be saying. And with that, I will turn it over to you, Justin.
Thank you, Amanda. Well, hello, everyone. Good morning, Bill. Great to talk to you again. I am super excited to cover this topic, kind of share our experience, kind of how we see the market landscape. It is an area of the business that seems to be exploding right now. So we've been supporting combination products for decades, and all of a sudden it just seems like with GLP-1s and platform devices and so many of these things, this area of the business is really transformed and galvanized, even for rare diseases and some of these new very focused science. So good to take the time to unpack all this today, and good to be indoors. It is freezing here near Chicago, and excited to be indoors and online here. So in terms of the session for today, we're going to cover a few different topics, hopefully cumulative in terms of the messaging and what we're going to talk about, and then we're definitely going to include time for questions as well. So firstly, we wanted to just kind of cover where we see the market, how the science is changing, how some of the patient population dynamic is changing, both in North America as well as Europe and rest of world markets. Talk a bit about the evolution of the patient experience as well, which is an area that I'm super excited about. Hopefully making a better patient experience and enabling better health outcomes in the process. We'll talk a bit about really kind of the fundamentals and the science and the pathway of looking at both the primary container for the sterile product, and then how that kind of cascades into specific device selection and what device you may target, or devices, potentially multiple. And then a lot of kind of insights or expertise to look at the best way to look at that clinical to commercial journey, because there is no one size fits all, and that's an area that can certainly be rife with nuance and considerations. And so we're hoping to enlighten people on a few of those considerations in that process and kind of catch them as they're transitioning, and then ultimately kind of looking at the tie off of all those things in terms of a good method. So if that all makes sense, we'll jump into it, Bill. So what we see today, certainly as PCI being a leading CDMO, we kind of track with where the market is and where the market is going. And by virtue of the fact that we do a lot of early stage science and formulation and talking about kind of the formulation of the drug, as well as then kind of shepherding that into clinical studies and kind of navigating clinical studies and ultimately commercializing those products, hopefully getting that FDA approval or EMA approval to get it across the finish line. We see the market in totality, both what's in early stage development as well as what's flowing through to commercialization. And so you're seeing a pretty significant shift in the market. This is not new information, but it seems to be amplified and continued. That trend towards the biologics market continuing to grow, the overall proportion of biologics that are in development as related to chemical drugs, that proportion is continuing to be strong and definitive. North of 40% of all the drugs that are getting across the finish line or in pipeline development, frankly, are biologic in nature. They come with all the considerations of biologics, sterile products, unique science, some sensitivities in terms of cold chain and those aspects of it. And all of that certainly is very material to what we'll talk about today, and certainly the routes of administration and those kinds of things. Layered on top of that, of course, is just overall, some other macro trends that we're seeing in the industry that do shape kind of the overall landscape. What's very interesting to me personally is the fact that the overall number of drugs that are in development right now continues to grow year over year at a rate of, almost 10% year over year growth, which is astounding, particularly if you think about coming out of COVID, if you think about some of the funding challenges that you're seeing in the industry, to continue to see that just overall pipeline growth, number of products, number of shots on goal, as it were, is pretty astounding. And so we're certainly seeing that in clinical studies. We're seeing that in the number of molecules being developed and researched. What comes alongside that, of course, then is we see overall market opportunity in global markets. So it's not just the established countries these days. We're seeing a lot of significant interest in rest of world markets, emerging markets, kind of outside the core European or North American or traditional Asia Pac markets. We're seeing more access to medicine in South America and EMA and the Middle East and places like that, which is also a significant impact in kind of the overall industry. But then also as we think about the approach to bringing products through the clinical and commercialization, that needs to really be factored in at the earliest stages of kind of the pathway considerations. We also see a lot of focus, and again, year over year focus in very targeted medicines or targeted patient populations. And so this, I think, also is very encouraging. I personally am very encouraged by that as I see these rare disease medicines not only being developed, but being commercialized and getting to patients that may have never had a treatment before. That's super encouraging. Likewise, as we get better and better about looking at the science around oncology and cancer therapies, we're seeing very targeted therapies now. And so they minimize the side effects. They get very targeted and very specific to the route administration that they need to succeed. But then again, that shapes the batch sizes and the patient populations and makes for very narrow patient populations. And so that dynamic is changing in our industry quite considerably. And certainly from a supply chain perspective, from a drug development perspective, and from an economics perspective, that's having an effect. Also super encouraging to look at new science in terms of the way that drugs are getting into patients and getting to their end destination in the body. That is really fascinating science, a fast-moving space. If we think about ADCs and oligonucleotides and those types of new medicines, that every time there's a new door opening in terms of the science behind these medicines that help make them more and more effective. And then likewise, just overall, you can't deny the impact right now of GLP-1s and some of these new medicines that are not only benefiting patients with diabetes, patients with weight considerations, but then also there may be additional avenues where these types of medicines are impacting things like Alzheimer's or heart disease or even potentially oncology. So we're seeing kind of how that is shaping the industry in new ways, and particularly as it relates to combination devices and the acceptance of self-administration. That's something we're keen to talk about today as well. Specifically for combination products, it is kind of a unique space. As we think about the regulatory pathway, the considerations for getting approval or even filing of a combination product is materially different. Inherently, it is the combination of a pharmaceutical product as well as a medical device. And so that overlay between the two shapes how a sponsor company is going to approach their clinical studies. It's going to shape the way that they approach their commercial filing, and certainly the success factors in terms of enabling patients for success. And so as we think about that, really looking at the patient in the forefront and the patient experience, we have to make sure that we have a fantastic drug. The drug works effectively, it is safe, it is delivered consistently, those types of things. And that will be both, the biology or chemistry of that drug product itself, as well as its sterile container, and making sure that is all safe and effective and reliable. That also will then come into play with the device itself. And those two things really can't be separated. The drug and the device are material to getting the product into the patient effectively. What comes alongside that, of course, is our ability to make sure that what surrounds that from a packaging, a labeling, a patient experience perspective is really set up for success. And so I almost look at it as three legs of a stool. Great drug, great device. We need packaging that gets it there safely, effectively, and hopefully also from that first opening of the box, it's intuitive to the patient or to the caregiver as to how to administer this product, how to do that safely, effectively, even how to potentially dispose of this product once they're done with the dosing. There's a lot of considerations there to literally unpack and to make sure that it's been well thought out with a good plan for success. And of course, what comes alongside that as well is the labeling, which is often an underconsidered aspect of this, making sure that the graphics, the information that's presented, the flow of information, the way that it's laid out is very intuitive, very easy to understand, even to a layman who may have never self-dosed or may have never administered the products. And oftentimes we also see complications even with professionals who do this on a day in and day out basis. We got to make sure the information is presented to them consistently and effectively so that they know exactly what they're supposed to be doing and successfully delivering that product. And so all of those things really need to click, and they need to click in both the context of a clinical study. They need to click in terms of a commercial product in an established market, and even potentially an emerging market as well. And so all of that thought process, all of that diligence needs to go into the earliest stages of consideration for a drug device combination product to set the patient up for success. Bill, do you want to walk us through the kind of flow of, some of those earliest considerations and earliest stages of clinical study and kind of cascading that through to the device?
Yeah, certainly. We'll start here with the general construct, and then we'll move into some of the specifics, because for those that might be new to this may look like it's a very ambiguous, lot of decisions to make, when in reality, the industry has evolved towards some standards that help things go a lot faster than one might think. But in general, we're going to talk through what we are seeing. There is no one way to do this. There are a lot of paths and ways to get there, but one of the common things that we are seeing is starting in phase 1 with vial and syringe, established dosing. After that dosing is established, if there's a desire to go beyond vial and syringe, you start to make a decision whether it's prefilled syringe or cartridge as primary drug container, as we're depicting here. Now, one thing that's beautiful about the prefilled syringe is the flexibility you get. A prefilled syringe can be accessorized with a plunger rod and a backstop. It can be used with a passive needle safety device to provide an additional layer of safety, or it can be used with an auto injector, which from a patient perspective, it's 2 or 3 steps, highly automated, hides the needle, very attractive form there, or go with some combination of those 3 between a prefilled syringe, accessorized, needle safety device, or auto injector. So that becomes one common pathway, and we'll spend a lot more time talking about this pathway toward auto injectors. The other pathway is with a cartridge. So cartridges are used primarily in pens, although there are some auto injectors that do use cartridges, and then also find their way into larger volumes for on-body injectors as well. So we'll use this framework as a way to kind of dive a little bit deeper into a couple of different things here. But just wanted to lay out this framework of what we're typically seeing, where this is starting in phase 1, begin working on strategy, and if heading down the auto injector path, prefilled syringe might emerge in phase 2, and then in phase 3 clinical trials, that's where you would see the emergence of needle safety devices and auto injectors. Want to emphasize no one path. This is the more common approach that we are seeing at PCI as of late.
And Bill, the image that you show there actually looks like a staked needle with a needle safety guard on it. And so you're suggesting that would go both in the needle safety device as well as the auto injector as is?
That's correct. You get to use the exact same pre-filled syringe and carry it down to a needle safety device or the auto injector, thus providing that great degree of flexibility.
Excellent.
So you have to start by saying, we'll focus a little bit of auto injectors here. How do I decide what direction to go? Because there are so many options out there. So usually the decision drivers are focused on about 5 different things. One of them is a company or a segment strategy. Some larger biopharma companies do have their own IP devices, pens, auto injectors, on-body injectors. Others make a strategic decision to leverage platform providers, and PCI does work in both of those in both of those situations. And beyond that strategy, start customizing to the patient needs, cost and reimbursement economics, which tend to look different for a pre-filled syringe and needle safety device than they do for an auto injector, for example. The environment, there are reusable devices as well as disposable devices, and also the need for differentiation. And we'll dive into that need for differentiation in a bit. But when you break that all down, we talk about auto injectors. The good news is there are standards that have emerged and have taken good hold across industry. First, in auto injectors, the 1 ml widely used and commercialized. The 2.25 ml being the next size up in auto injectors is gaining acceptance. There are some approvals, but certainly gaining more and more acceptance and momentum. And now, as you hit the conferences and see what the platform providers are offering today, a high emphasis on large volume. And large volume, this is typically getting into auto injectors that are between 5 ml to 10 ml. So a lot of work to be done before those are mainstream. But again, good news being the 1 ml and a 2.25 ml auto injectors, well accepted, and most important, a lot of choices to be had and a lot of capacity out there to fulfill the needs for many different drugs, whether it's rare and orphan, all the way up to supersized programs.
Bill, it seems that the 1 ml and the 2.25 seem to be relatively consistent in terms of the function and the aesthetics and those things, just obviously slightly bigger for the 2.25. But it seems like the kind of this emerging market of the auto injectors for the larger sizes, it might be quite a bit different. Do you see it the same way?
Yeah, that's right on, Justin. Because what you'll see is with the auto injector platform providers today, most of them have both a 1 ml version and a 2.25 ml version to choose from. And they're built under essentially the same architecture, just upsized slightly. But then as you start getting into the large volume auto injectors, now they're going to look a bit different. But there's a lot of commonality between the 1 ml and the 2.25 ml auto injectors. And again, that's to your benefit as you're nailing down what your formulation is going to look like and what primary container is going to be your best fit.
Absolutely.
So now if we dig in a little bit and say, okay, on devices, as I referenced earlier, there are ways, and there are certainly large established biopharma companies that have their own IP platforms, whether it's pens, auto injectors, or on-body injectors. That is certainly one path. The other paths are taking as close to standard third-party platforms as possible. A lot of choices and a lot of benefits there, and we'll break that down a bit. But then there's also a middle ground of taking a customized third-party platform and kind of making that your own version that no one else will have. But there's some trade-offs to be had, and those trade-offs are typically going to come under that form of differentiation, the device unit cost, and also the one-time upfront cost and time for development, as well as the ability to take on and use existing infrastructure. And we talk about that existing infrastructure. That's not only on the device, but on the combination product manufacturing. Very important to look at both of those. And then finally, the regulatory risk. One of the benefits of having an established platform from a regulatory perspective, is that it's going to become familiar to the regulators because it's been used on multiple drug programs. Now, when you start looking at some of these top of the list considerations here between differentiation, device unit cost, and development cost, there's a lot to unpack there. And a lot of it's driven by, on that cost side, how much demand you expect to have. Because today, while the obesity drugs that may have tens or even hundreds of millions of units of demand, we know that that's on the high side of the market. The typical biologics program that's seen at PCI is hundreds of thousands to low millions of units a year and doesn't necessarily need dedicated capacity. Some things may even be tens of thousands of units a year. So this being able to use existing infrastructure becomes very important. But if we do a quick breakdown on what happens on those economics, when you're starting out at low volumes, certainly there's a high investment to have your own IP platform. You get high on the innovation side of things, but those upfront costs are very high, and it's hard to get into and get enough scale to drive those economics. But certainly if you get into super high volumes, this is where an own IP product can make sense, because now you've got that scale behind you to offset all of those upfront time and cost that then make it worthwhile. So therefore, what we see is that bifurcation. Those large biopharma that have the scale to justify their own upfront investments and time will head that path. The vast majority of what we see, however, does tend to use existing third-party platforms, which offer the speed and the reduced time and cost upfront to get there in exchange for a slightly higher unit cost.
Yeah, and this is an area that I'm certainly very encouraged by as we look at rare disease or very targeted therapies where they're getting the benefit of that established mature standard platform as you were discussing, and so certainly a benefit to patients as they're looking to commercialize in a drug device combination product. And then likewise, as you're talking about, the image on the right there, where you're starting to see some of these medicines gaining additional indications and kind of broadening their patient pool, they then can do a bit more customization or some of the unique things that it might be, a value add to some of those patients in terms of ergonomics or other considerations as well.
So now that we've talked about some of those trade-offs on the device side of things, Justin, I'm going to turn it back over to you. We can talk about those different options that you might consider on how to commercialize your combination product.
Absolutely. Yeah, so this is an area of the business that is significantly evolving based on those prior points that we had discussed between Bill and I. As we look at our time in this industry and our time, supporting combination products as well as other drugs that are in traditional drug delivery forms, there had been a previously established method, right? There was a drive towards doing a lot of the clinical scale, investigation in traditional drug delivery forms. That's the very safe approach. That's the very risk-averse approach. Certainly from an economics perspective, vials are a great way to administer a study simply because it's a very mature drug delivery form, a lot of infrastructure, a lot of capacity in the industry and those types of things. And so often what we had seen in the past was that a sponsor company would certainly do their phase 1 studies in those vials, small patient populations, get quick data, get that readout. But as they were scaling up, they were continuing to use that same method in the phase 2 studies as they, broader patient populations, broader geography. And then likewise, as you're starting to get to some of those pivotal phase 3 studies, still predominantly using vials, might start to introduce syringes on a limited basis, but all of that body of work through the phase 1 through phase 3, all that data leading into your actual filing was done in those drug delivery forms. And then ultimately trying to convince regulators that they could transition over to a drug device combination product. And again, having the burden of proof to demonstrate to the regulators that the two are equivalent both in terms of bioavailability and the effectiveness of the drug, as well as, you know, the success of the patient, whether that's self-administration or potentially HCP administration. And so that traditionally has been the method, again, very risk averse, and done, you know, probably more on a limited basis at scale. Now that we see this market wave hitting, again, you know, the platform devices are more mature. As Bill mentioned earlier, more of these products have been commercialized, both in bespoke devices, as well as, you know, a lot more in the platform device technologies, as well as the GLP-1s, and the industry is getting the benefit of large amounts of people self-dosing potentially with GLP-1s. And so there's more comfort level with self-administration and this idea. And so now we're really seeing a paradigm shift in the industry. We are seeing this desire for sponsor companies to start to look at introducing those devices at the clinical stages. And again, this is an area that I think is really value added for the sponsor companies themselves. I think it's value added for the regulatory bodies that need to look and approve of these drug delivery forms and new medicines. And the idea is that, again, phase 1 study, very small, very targeted, get your data quickly, you know, likely still going to be executed in vial formats and that method. But in those earliest days now, we're starting to see consideration for that other primary container that is going to be the pathway for them to get to a drug device combination product. And so it may be that they start to look and start to do some of the science around getting into a prefilled syringe, as an example, at the earliest stages, as they're starting to get their first safety data out of that phase 1 study. Again, as they're scaling phase 2, you know, continuing to utilize some of those traditional drug delivery forms. But now if you have that data in the syringe, that allows you to potentially utilize a traditional syringe, a syringe with a needle safety device, or even potentially start to consider, you know, that leak to an auto injector as an example. And then likewise, as you're starting to get into phase 3 studies, you're broadening your patient population, you've got more users, more data points. But if you can get the benefit of doing that with the actual device that you intend to commercialize in, that is a significant leap in terms of not only the cleanliness of the data that's coming from your clinical study, both in the effectiveness of the drug, but then also that demonstration that these patients can be successful self-dosing. If they are able to figure it out, even, you know, with the sterile nature of a clinical study and limited amount of labeling and those types of things, it really is a great demonstration to FDA or EMA or whomever you're filing with, that these patients are set up for success and they're seeing the health outcomes that we would expect because we've done all of this diligence. And so that really is a traditional market dynamic that is very much changing, a paradigm shift that we're seeing in the industry. And I'm very encouraged by that, by many of the virtues that we talked about. The infrastructure is maturing, the devices are maturing, there's more products that have been commercialized, and therefore that old adage of rising tides raising all boats is really certainly coming into play in the market.
Yeah. And Justin, I want to emphasize one takeaway before we go on to your next slide. In order to make this drug and device in parallel work and get that combination product to market faster, the clinical and commercial launch teams need to work really closely together. And the next slide Justin will walk through is some of those things that need to happen in order for that strategy to work well together.
Absolutely. Yeah, I think Bill, you hit on an excellent point, and it's through the fault of nobody, but, you know, oftentimes as we look at sponsor companies and those relationships that we have, it often can be clinical, you know, the clinical team working in their silo and the commercial team working in their silo, and that proverbial throw it over the fence type of approach. And again, it's not intentional. I think it's just the way that a lot of companies are organized. You know, everybody kind of stays in their lane, and, you know, they cross over when they need to. But to be successful in this space, to have that kind of big roadmap of, you know, earliest phases of phase 1 study to ultimate, you know, rest of world commercialization and making sure we're set up to support patients all throughout, you know, we absolutely need to be in lockstep with a common architecture and a common set of goals and expectations. And some of this stuff is new to the clinical trial space, and so the clinical teams are learning how to support combination products. What is the timing of some of the key sequential things that need to happen that are unique to combination product filings? And I think that's an area that the industry is learning, certainly from a PCI CDMO perspective. We can bring some expertise to that conversation to make sure that they're seeing the big picture, or they're cognizant of some of the regulatory deliverables that need to happen at a certain interval in that pathway. It is very complicated, and hopefully, collectively we can kind of lower some of the anxiety associated with that, because we're seeing more and more products get across the finish line. We're getting more familiarity of that within the industry, and then certainly as we as PCI are able to kind of bring a lot of those types of products to market ourselves, we bring a lot of that expertise to our sponsor company clients as well. So I would say that's true certainly of the combination device development and the packaging and labeling side of things. I think it really overlays also with that sterile fill finish and formulation type aspects of the drug as well. Sometimes those teams can work it, in their own lane or their own silo. And as evidenced by the slide that we showed earlier, you really have to be kind of considering all of those aspects collectively or comprehensively to be successful. And so that's another area where we're hoping to raise awareness and getting those teams pulled together, the CMC teams and the drug substance drug development teams, talking with the combination product teams, talking with the clinical trial labeling teams, the clinical supply planning teams, and then really looking at the totality of the supply chain as well in terms of where those activities are being done, both geographically, at what scale, what infrastructure as well. There's a lot to tie together there. And not to sound over intimidating, but certainly there's a lot of considerations there that we want to make sure that we're talking about and kind of taking that big picture approach. So yeah, a lot of stuff to discuss in that, and that could be a webinar unto itself.
So as PCI has done many of these programs, we found a good place to start the discussion is with a really simple question. How much clear runway do you want to have to support your commercial launch after your successful clinical trials, right? So if we're talking about trying to do these things in parallel, that means thinking about what clinical volumes I need and what commercial volumes I need in parallel, which starts to get into the ability to reuse capacity for clinical and commercial and create that what we'll call clear runway. So we boiled this down to 5 points for clinical to commercial supply chain success. First, able to use existing component supply chains, whether it's on prefilled syringes, stoppers, etc., or on the devices. Second, carry that same philosophy through to use flexible, established equipment for assembly, label, pack, and testing. Don't forget the testing. And third, in many cases, you can even make use of established final assembly and test tooling, so your upfront capital investment is really minimized. And then fourth, perhaps the most important, is make sure that there's an integrated strategy for that validation. Because if you validate once, you validate right, now you've got that clear runway to just use that same existing supply chain that you used in human use clinicals, just carry that exact same supply chain forward into your commercial launch, obviously with the adjustments to the labeling and packaging that are going to be different between clinical and commercial. And fifth, for those programs that are going to need dedicated capacity, make sure you know what those clear decision points are. It may make sense to start with shared capacity and flexible equipment. It may make sense to start with dedicated capacity and bespoke equipment. Main thing here is have clear decision points on when you need dedicated assets versus when you can use existing flexible equipment tooling. And so here's our wrap up. I think this slide is really just a summary of what we've already covered, and I think we're able to turn this over for questions. Amanda?
Yes, so awesome. So we didn't have any questions come through. We can spend a minute or two now. If anybody has any, please put them in. If not, we will definitely keep moving on.
Bill, question for you. Obviously, you've had 30 plus years in the combination devices landscape. As we talk about considerations for platform device development and platform sterile container versus, a custom sterile container or a custom device, what, if there's a kind of general rule of thumb, how much difference do you see in terms of the runway for establishing a platform device versus a non-platform device? Is that months, years, decades?
Yeah. That's a good question. And if you take a look at, going back to the first insulin pens, for example, right? It does take years to develop a bespoke device, clear the IP and FTO, get everything set, and then the large investments are required, not just in the development to get through DV testing and know that you've got a good device, but then you've got to scale the device and you've got to scale the combination product manufacturing alongside, of course, the fill finish to go with that. So it's a major undertaking to develop your own, which again is why the third-party platform providers are experiencing such growth. For these things that require tens of thousands to millions of units, and just being able to leverage that infrastructure there, and then on the device, and then similarly leverage the infrastructure from the likes of PCI on the combination product, whether it's clinical or commercial.
Awesome. Thank you. So obviously that brings us to the end of today's session. So first I want to say thank you to the two of you for joining us today and providing your insights and your expertise. Really do appreciate your time. I know that you guys are both super busy, so definitely appreciate that. And I also want to say thank you to everybody on the call who has joined us today. We really do appreciate your continued support and interest in these webinars that we do like to put on for our client base. We do hope that this session gave you some actionable insights that can align early phase clinical planning with long-term commercial objectives, creating that flexible, efficient pathway from first-in-human studies to global launch. This, as you've seen, this session has been recorded, so we will be sharing this recording within the next few days, so please do keep an eye on your inboxes for those resources. And I would like to invite you to explore our Expert Exchange platform, which sits on our website. You can simply scan the QR code that you see on the screen right now, which will take you right there and give you access to a wealth of scientific insights and knowledge resources. All of our thought leadership and expert insights are there, and you can go ahead and just kind of scroll through those. And then also stay tuned for future invitations for upcoming Expert Exchange webinars, which we do cover a range of trending topics. We are also open to any topic suggestions that you may have, so please do feel free to reach out to me. You should have my email in your inboxes. And with that, I just want to say thank you again for your time and participation, and hope you all have a great day.
Thanks, Amanda.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
The science, the skill, and foresight that drives the delivery of life-changing therapies. We are your world-leading CDMO. This is Expert Exchange. Together, delivering life-changing therapies. Let's talk future.